Let's get some analysis with Robert Kelly. He's a professor of political science at Pusan National University, speaking to us from Columbus, Ohio. Professor Kelly, thank you so much for your time. Now, hearing from Donald Trump there that both sides agreed to abide by the ceasefire, but given the long-standing tensions between these neighbors that seem to continue to escalate, do you think this latest truce, if that's indeed what this is, will actually hold this time?
I'm skeptical. Part of the problem with Donald Trump's ceasefire and peacemaking efforts traditionally in the last 10 months or so that he's been pursuing this in various other places is that often these are very personalistic, which is to say that they're often based on phone calls by the president or visits from his personal friends, such as Steve Witkoff in Ukraine, right? You go and actually talk to these people individually and sort of shake their hands and, I don't know, drink tea or something like that. And that's not traditionally how international diplomacy has done, right? Traditionally, there's a long buildup of diplomats, bureaucrats, legal people sitting down in conference rooms behind closed doors, hammering out the issues, right? In this case, for example, right, a lot of this is about sort of territorial disputes that go back to colonial era, colonial times, 100 years ago or further. And so these things are pretty deeply rooted. And it's really not typically possible for heads of state just kind of get on the phone and sort of iron out these things with a quick call and some vague threats, Trump's preferred tool being tariff threats. And so I am skeptical, right? I mean, if you look at sort of successful peace deals that U.S. presidents have brokered, probably the most famous is between Israel and Egypt back in the 1970s. That took a lot of work. President Jimmy Carter was heavily involved, knew a lot about it. There had been a lot of work done before the meeting between the three, Israel, the United States, and in Egypt at Camp David. And then that truce was brokered and it held. But there was a big buildup. And Trump, of course, is just not. He just doesn't do that kind of staff work, right? We know that Trump just doesn't put in the time, reading the memos and sitting down with the various players and sort of hammering out and going through the details. And so that's kind of a long answer to answer your question, which is to say probably not, because without that depth of work, the parties, often don't know what the deal actually is, and so infractions become easy.
But Trump certainly has done things very differently during his presidency, especially when it comes to these diplomatic measures that go beyond the norm, if we can say that. But why has he been so involved, do you think, in trying to get this conflict to end, but also at the same time using the United States' economic power as leverage here, it would seem, to get both sides to bring the fighting to an end?
Yeah, I think for Trump himself personally, I hate to sound cynical here, I don't actually think Trump knows or cares a great deal about Southeast Asia. I think for Donald Trump, this is really bound up in his deep desire to win a Nobel Peace Prize, which that's just something that sort of all of us in the world have come to sort of see about Trump in the last 8 months. He's really desperate to get one of these. Why exactly is not clear to me. Winning the Nobel Peace Prize is not something traditionally that Republican presidents in the United States have cared about because of the perception that that's some kind of like European sort of woke award or something like that. But Trump really wants this, perhaps because Barack Obama got one, 15 years ago, and President Trump really dislikes Barack Obama, and there's a sense of competition. Perhaps it's that, but I really think that is why Trump has interjected himself here, but he's done it again in this very sort of Trumpian way, right? Which is that he kind of gets on the phone and he makes some threats and he says, you got to stop doing this, but he doesn't actually get involved in the details. He doesn't send people over there to sort of hammer out the specifics. And so again, I'm pretty confident saying this thing won't last very long, maybe 6 months or something like that. If you look at the peace deals in Ukraine, they kind of come and go on a fairly regular basis. And as for tariffs, I mean, that has emerged as Trump's sort of all-purpose diplomatic tool for almost everything, right? I mean, he sort of uses tariffs against U.S. allies when they do things he doesn't like. He's, threatened tariffs against Russia to get to Russia to come to the table in Ukraine, right? He's threatened tariffs against China, right? Trump is kind of becoming a one-horse trick on tariffs. It's his sort of, stick of choice, if you will.
Professor, concerning the conflict itself, as it stands, we're hearing now from Cambodia. They say that the Thai army is still dropping bombs on its territory. We also know that Thailand's Prime Minister has recently dissolved parliament, paving the way for elections. Does all of that play in politically with how the conflict with Cambodia continues, or is that decision-making now really left to the Thai army to decide how to move forward?
Yeah, so I would imagine that to the extent that the previous government was making things particularly difficult, right? I mean, to the extent that the two sides' extant governments were those that collided together, elections should make things easier. You see the same kind of argument made in Ukraine or in Israel, right? That if Netanyahu was not in power in Israel, it might be easier to come to a deal with the Palestinians. Right? Russia traditionally makes this argument about Zelensky in Ukraine, that if Zelensky wasn't president, the Ukrainians might be a little bit more flexible. And so perhaps if there's going to be actual change towards a partisan political change in Thailand, that might actually open up some space. But as you pointed out, right, I mean, once you actually enter conflicts, militaries become bureaucratically and organizationally invested in the outcome. In this case, right, the territory particularly is very sticky, right? I mean, countries really fight over territory. States are really territorial. They don't like giving up or ceding what they believe to be theirs. And you see that in China, India, for example. And so I would imagine that the more this thing rolls on, right, the more the conflict becomes militarized, as you say, the more the Thai military becomes the primary driver on the Thai side of this, then the harder it will be for the government to rein them in.
Professor Robert Kelly, great to get your take. Thank you very much live there to us from Columbus, Ohio.
Thank you.